RJ. You don't want to see me in dreadlocks. It's got a nice beat. Yay! Are we on the air? Okie doke. Yes,
I'm trying to find which one I've got you on. Have I got you on the 5? Have I got you on this one? I had it all set up and now it's all jacked up and weird.
Oh, well, that's me to a T there. I'm jacked up and weird.
All right, well, go ahead and talk and I'll
community.
sort this out. I don't know what's happened
I'm
with
somewhere. Anyway, part of the show is a discussion of the source analysis of Replacing Darwin, the wondrously overblown tome of Nathaniel Jeanson, who is since he's a big player in young Earth creationism, it's entirely appropriate to dive into him in some detail because he's a big player. And we know that Standing for Truth treats him as an oracle, and there's a whole bunch of people that percolate around through that area. Plus, there's a impromptu element that popped up because we just watched Erica debate Nephilim free on the ARC issue on Modern Day Debate, and that was a mind bender of a show. And that's actually
won?
Yeah. Well, Neff always thinks he won. That kind of goes without saying, but I think Erica did a really wonderful presentation, and Colton and I and TD and others were up burning the midnight oil yesterday, helping her coordinate her source material stuff, and I think she appreciated that, and I learned crap in that as well. We explored.
What that taught me is just how true the saying is: if it for 5 seconds of bullshit, it takes like 5 hours of work.
Yeah. And this won't be a lost material because we will incorporate the fruits of our various labors in an info box in volume 2, because Neff just tramples on an awful lot of stupid. Yeah, you gonna say something, Tornado?
Yeah. Neffy actually thinks the flood is true.
Oh yeah.
Yes,
he's a full-blown young Earth creationist. He's a
you didn't know this?
Yeah, you didn't know Nephilim Free was a young earther? Oh god,
dude, he's well known for this.
He's a young earther and a flat earther.
No,
he's a geocentrist.
That's a different one. There are several ones that riff off of that Nephilim bit in the YouTube sphere. And Nephilim. Once you hear Nephilim, you will never forget Nephilim. No matter how hard you try, his voice will be like a pall of doom in your imagination.
Sigh constantly, and I don't know.
RJ. As Vesta Freya described it before, Neffy's voice is like fingers on a chalkboard.
Yeah, at a low frequency. Because he has a low droning voice. The problem is he's relatively humorless. And he's also pompous as all get out when he was trying to mansplain to Erica about the geologic column and deposition and things, as though, well, she's a simple.
So if this was a conversation about is the arc viable, why was he trying to argue about rock?
Oh, because that's the apologetics. I mean, we have to remember, anybody that reads the Genesis story, and by all means read the Genesis story, it's really fast. It's only like a couple pages in the average Bible. It's very vague. And everything about the doctrine is stuff that's accumulated over time. And worse, it's evolved over time. So the apologetics of the floodists of 1980 and the John Woodmer apps of the 1990s and the early 2000s-ish, and then the AIG Ark Encounter supertanker, all have kind of tweaked things as they try to retrofit and come up with a model and a design for the Ark that's as plausible in their frame as possible.
Let me put it this way: their first go-to is they want to make the Ark story plausible by denigrating science, and they'll always come out with this old trodden. You can only find the geologic column in one place, and that's the textbooks.
Yeah, but they won't ever. That's always in the popular young Earth creationist literature. But they admit in their I don't even see it in their like popular texts of them admitting no, it's real. It's in their own publications where only their own professionals read it. They don't like telling their own people that it's a real thing.
What I liked most was Nephilim racing like an Olympic sprinter away from the issue of the heat, because it was a simple fact that, holy moly, they have a problem with that. This is not some little trivial detail. This is vaporizing the earth heat.
RJ, it gets even worse, because the most plausible method of getting all the water required onto Earth in the first place, you can't do it with hydroplates, because that would liquefy the surface as you have huge slabs of rock crashing into the asthenosphere, as in the magma of the Earth. The weight of all that rock would crack the asthenosphere, revealing massive multi-gigaton volcanic eruptions across the entire planet at the same time.
Toasty.
The most plausible method of getting all of the water required to flood the Earth onto the Earth in the first place, save via magic, and we know magic, they have to default to that, but the most plausible method is for an ice ball containing all of the water necessary to flood the Earth. And
that was a theory for a while.
The Hovian, the ice canopy model. Kent Hovian has a compressed version of that, the ice snowball approach. They still talk about Whitmore. What isn't he one of those that still pushes the idea about the or who was fielding the notion about there being a big super comet, and it produced the rings of Saturn. I know Kent's mentioned this, and
I don't remember who did that.
I actually ran some numbers on it, and having a giant ice ball with all the water necessary to flood the Earth, never mind create the rings around the Saturn, a giant ice ball capable of carrying enough water to flood the Earth, upon impact, would dump all of its energy right into the asthenosphere. The fireball generated by the impact would be greater than the radius, or no, not the radius of the Earth, the entire diameter of the Earth. The entire circumference of the Earth is less than the radius of the
accelerated radioactive decay and impact craters. No, you've just got this positive parfait of cataclysmic heat sources. And for Neff to simply say, well, it's an unexplained thing. No, this is not a minor unexplained thing. This is your argument bursting into flames.
This is the argument bursting into flames. The yield from this impact would be sufficient to crack the Earth in two, if not fracture the planet into different pieces entirely.
So I'm going to go ahead and propose that this entire thing actually happened on the moon, and this is where the Quran gets the idea that Muhammad split the moon in half.
Yeah, it's just as plausible. It works out.
Justice
anyway,
free of evidence.
So we'll leave out all of that little material. That what we'll probably be doing various midnight oil sessions exploring some of these things, because there's just questions that Neffy was just dangling on the sideline, including this new kangaroo from India that he's just trotted out, that I'm sure he's not getting it from a typical secular source. And we'll see what all that stuff is. That all of this is a moving target, and that's one of the reasons why we want Volume 2 of Rocks to be picking up on all of this stuff, to give stuff so that by the time the thing sees publication, it'll still be very much up to speed. Anyway, on the salmon sperm, the wonderful bit in the chapter 2 that Jeanson does, it's actually a very non-controversial discussion of genetics and the history of genetics and how they worked out that nucleotides and DNA was at the core of this. And it actually was kind of a funky surprise because he links to an awful lot of really old science work that was done in the 1920s and 1940s and that I really actually wasn't aware of, although I'm sure it's brought up in a lot of biology texts and history material. But one that intrigued me was the issue as they were beginning to notice. Jeanson doesn't make a big deal out of it, but it's intriguing the reason why they started figuring out about this connection between nucleotides and inheritance is that they could measure the A's and the T's and the C's and the G's, fine and dandy, all those cute little things, and they seem to always be kind of the same amounts, that there would be the same amount as A as T and the same amount as C and G. Well, we know that because they pair up in the DNA molecule, and there's a reason why that's pretty much the case. But the intriguing thing was that some of this work that was done in the 1940s was done by, I just love the title of the paper here, the composition of the deoxyribonucleic acid of salmon sperm. That's where this was coming from. So part of the reason why, and this was from 1951, just before, it was published in 1952, so it's right before Watson and Crick and that are working out the structure of DNA. And of course, you had Linus Pauling thinking it was some sort of a protein, and there was a big fuss bother. There was a funky little show that was done years ago with, I think, Jeff Goldblum played Crick, and I can't remember, Piggott Smith, I think, played Watson. And there was also material about Rosalind Franklin. It was a very nice little documentary style historical drama from.
Wait, you mean Mr.
80s. Yeah.
Life
Anyway,
finds a way.
So the idea that looking at not merely sperm in general, but fish sperm was one of the connecting links that permitted them to understand why there was the balance there was between nucleic acids and all of that. I find just absolutely delightful. And I would have thought it, and I wonder why he didn't allude to this in the text. And the thing that makes me think that he didn't want to discuss it, because he just has it as a technical paper in the notes, is it involves sex. It involves sperm. And maybe he feels uncomfortable. Maybe he's like Vice President Pence, he just says, Mother, should I discuss this in the book? No. So there's that part. The other one that is kind of interesting that I had not read it before, although because I've been a Stephen Jay Gouldy for a long time, but I didn't necessarily read a lot of his technical literature because I was picking up on his columns that he did in natural history all through the 1980s and that, and his various major books and stuff later on. But along the way, he cites this we get this source on the promise of paleobiology as a nomothetic evolutionary discipline that pops up in a completely different context. And I thought that was an intriguing little piece of old science to bring up. It popped up. It actually wasn't involving Jeanson. It came up with a completely different side issue that I was researching. And for those who aren't aware of Jay Gould in his full-blown science writing mode, not popular articles, not stuff he did for the books, but for this paper from Paleobiology from 1980 is just a perfect introduction, because he is just a persnickety cuss for wondering, what can we know? Are there general principles of evolution? The punctuated equilibrium fits into that, and contingency fits into that. How much of that's going on? If you replay the tape of life, how much of that's true? How do you work this out? What's going to be the connection between working out paleontology and bringing in developmental biology and genetics, which eventually became Evo Devo, and somebody like Neil Shubin is a perfect exemplar of that in the 21st century. Well, all of that was future when Gould is kind of laying out laying down gauntlets as to challenges and limitations and difficulties, and then again that fabulous prose that Gould has, with festooned with semicolons and long paragraph sentences. So I thought that those who want to dive into that kind of aspect, it may come as kind of a shock if all you know about Gould are some little authority quote bits that pop up in creationist literature. You can kind of dive into his viewpoint and get it directly. You were harumphing over there, Tornado?
I was sneezing.
Oh, okay. I do that too occasionally. I think it's a mammalian reflex, But yes, I'm curious. Yes, do birds sneeze? I don't know. That's an interesting little question. That's one of those things you would get on one of those that seems so obvious that I guess probably insects don't. I think there was what was the show I was just seeing? Oh, there's a series on a PBS. I'm rambling now. On the Spy in Nature series or something like that. Spies in the Wild. They build these little unbelievably intricate audio animatronic robots that they masquerade as little teeny gerbils and cats and koalas and birds. They've actually got ones with little like they're drones with propellers on them, but they're pretending to be a bird or a hummingbird, and so they can get in close and do things and not be arousing the suspicion. They have polar bears and alligators, and it's just amazing what they've been doing. They had done it in a similar way with BBC a few years ago, but they've just gone hog wild with it in this new series.
Just to let you know, birds can sneeze. I just looked
thank
it
you
up.
very much. Yeah, I would
You're
suspect it's
welcome.
probably due to the fact that they are tetrapods with lungs, and so they've got the same kind of dynamic problems where they can get it back up.
But they can't cough because they don't have a diaphragm.
Yeah. And there's a bit on diaphragm issues and the evolution of why the mammals have them and others don't, and the extent to which that developmental system is actually presaged a little bit amongst the crocodiles and others. Crocodiles are the fascinating bunch. I've been fascinated with them for years because we're just used to your classic alligators and gars and crocodiles and stuff like that. But the crocodiles as a group used to be ridiculously diverse compared to what they are. Not only did they have monster versions that munched dinosaurs for lunch, but also in the Mesozoic, but also swimming, completely flippered versions, fully aquatic ones. They had long sprinting, the Lagasucids and stuff. And so you had, and there's evidence that the heart system of crocodiles used to be a more complex four-chambered variety, but kind of settled back into the version that's not quite standard reptile in the modern crocodiles. So we're seeing a tiny little tip of the iceberg that they can draw some inferences because they have the genomes of the existing crocodiles to go by. But that's just pathetic compared to the diversity of crocodiles in the Mesozoic. I've alluded to them in TIP. I've alluded to them in Evolution Slam Dunk, and we call attention to them in The Rocks Were There because they're just cool. Anyway, we were about to say.
And RJ, the most fascinating thing is that unlike dinosaurs, where we only have two groups of birds, with crocodiles, there were crocodilians that aren't our modern groups of crocodiles that survived the fucking KT.
Oh yeah, and that's an intriguing thing. It's now getting into a weird circumstance because they incubate their eggs by temperature. That there's a worry that warming temperatures are going to change the sex balances between the males and females that could have deleterious effects on them. But the argument is, and this goes back to that Gould article, that he wasn't specifically talking about crocodiles, but the whole issue is how much of the way things turn out is due to the ineluctable processes that's going to happen inevitably, or just the luck of the draw, the accident of happenstance, the fact that you just happen to be in the wrong niche at the wrong time and things channel you into an element. And the crocodiles would be an example of that, to where how inevitable was it that they kind of got into this hunker down mode? Was it a very small number of lineages that managed to squeak through the KT, whereas all of the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct, all of the enanthropine birds went extinct? Don't forget there were more birds around than just the ornithines that are the ancestors of the modern birds. They were already on play, but they were not the dominant birds. One thing that we have as a potential testable hypothesis here, if you want to talk big picture.
You can't test the past, RJ.
Yeah, maybe I have a time machine, but anyway. Anyway, is the issue, is it the case that the dominant group is actually not the most inevitable one? That it has a dominance for a long time, but the ones that eventually branch off and get new days in the sun are the little niche groups that are off in a little corner, and they're really good at what they do, and they're really resilient, and maybe they just have just the right little characteristics. And what are those characteristics? Gould, were he alive today, would be asking exactly those kind of questions. Are there general principles that you can view? And to some extent, as we get more and more data field and more understanding of genetics and more understanding of all of the ways to interconnect and more application of mathematical modeling and nonlinear dynamics and all of this stuff, computer technology and visualization and the ability to do zillions of test out the modules modeling and all of that, is that you can, in principle, not necessarily in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, but maybe farther on, start generating what some of these higher level elements are, which, by the way, connects to the other half of the discussion, which came up completely off the wall. And I'm going to mangle his name here because I think it's Jess Sezkansky Moir. It's got a hyphen in it. And he's a biologist. I encountered him on Twitter, and he's done published work and all fascinating, and he studies biogeography issues. And he did a song during, he was in the lockdown. He couldn't do his regular work. So he came up and did a song on the biogeography and the island rule, and whether or not it's been established as to how endemic species vary according to archipelagos and as they move from one island to another and all that. So there were actually a mass of technical papers that he was riffing off of in this bloody song. So I put the link up in the YouTube to where you go on. It's like about 10 minutes long, and it's really amusingly done.
RJ,
Yeah.
From Ian Chen in chat. Hi, RJ and Jackson, albeit Jackson isn't here. You'll be pleased to know that mammals and rocks are heading their way to Erica.
Ah, oh ho! That must be Ian Chan. Yes, Erica, Ian Chen, who is a ridiculously generous chap who has underwritten Patreons and is really wonderful. Anyway, he's made it an obsession to go out and find people who don't have either one of my books and the one I co-authored with Jackson, and make sure that they have them. And so that's helping sales. Thank you very much. We appreciate we get the book royalties. Anyway, on this matter of the biogeographic stuff, and you know, if Jackson were here, he would be jumping in as well, because he's just as fascinated with animal biogeography as I am. And anybody who is an opponent of young Earth creationists needs to know this subject, because this is a terrible problem for creationism, which is why are animals distributed the way they are, in particular on islands, in particular endemic island species. How did they get there? Hawaii is a fabulous example, because it's big enough. We know it can sustain quite large animals. And when they brought pigs there and humans settled the place, the pigs just went wild and they had a field day. There are no endemic large mammals anywhere on Hawaii. Why? Because they can't get there, because it's out in the middle of nowhere. The only thing you can find, insects that can blow there, bats that can fly there, birds that can fly there. Fruit flies apparently made it quite early, and like 80% of all the fruit fly species are in Hawaii. It's just, they just went ape shit in diversification in there and became highly specialized to stuff since then. But anyway, one of the papers that the video song was riffing off of was a paper from Evolution from 2018, retracing the Hawaiian silver sword radiation despite phylogenetic, biogeographic, and paleogeographic uncertainty, which is about this particular plant species and looking at the various islands and that. And what it's funky with that, and the other papers that I link in the notes is that this issue is complicated. That nature is really complicated. And when you think of all the interactions that go on in a species with the things it eats and the things that can eat it, and needing to deal with the climate and how much the climate is changing, and the land is moving in archipelagos like Hawaii, and the circumstances of climate issues, and the parasites they may or may not have with them, and the gut bacteria that they may or may not have. Try to work out all of those variables. So needless to say, it's a complex problem. And it's also an exemplary example of how real science wants to get it right. Mel, you know this full bore, that it's not good enough just to have a cute hypothesis. You want the right answer. And sometimes you have to go, you know, this is really difficult to figure out. We don't have sufficient data to do that. We're trying to do the work and all that kind of stuff. And then there's the nefs of the world that don't do any of the work, and they rely on the people who don't do any of the work, and they snark at the people who do the work, and yipes. So I hope to show, and Colton the same way, and you and your work and scientists, and Erica and her ways, and everybody that goes on about this, that the real science is neat. You'll learn about salmon sperm, and you find out about all of this stuff, and it's vastly more exciting and exhilarating, because it's the history of every place that you could ever think of, to turn into Carl Sagan, that the cosmos is everything that has ever been, everyone you ever knew has been on this planet, and all that. And so, of course, we should have interest in it because it's absolutely fascinating. And the claptrap cartoon that you get in the young Earth creationist model is just desiccated. It doesn't lead to anything. It makes people like Nephi seem really happy. I'm sure he's just feeling all cuddly about how he seems to understand these rocks and all this stuff. He has a comprehension of it within his framework. But those of us outside the box who are aware of how incompetent he is as a scholar and how limited his data field is and how limited the people he copies data field are. Yeah, we want to get more people to seduce them to the light side of the actual facts, and that to familiarize everybody with the tools you need to do that, to always say, don't take my word for it. Don't take anybody's word for it. Be inspired, yes, but don't take our word for it. And you should be able to quiz us. And that's one of the reasons why one of the rules I've done, and Colton, I think, has started to do the same thing. And Jackson was doing that in his videos, and everybody else that does stuff, is you want to make available primary source material that they can link to directly. And so it's one thing to offer just a discussion of the stuff. It's another thing to make it to literally point you and say, read on your own, study on your own. Because one of the reasons why I discovered in my work, and we'll suddenly get off of my talking perpetually and actually interact with the other guests on it. My proposition is that the most exhilarating things you discover are the things you find out in the process of looking up something else that suddenly brings up something that you didn't know about, and you start chasing that rabbit instead, and you find out even more things. That's happened with me. Colton, Dee, others, your experiences on that.
Yeah, that was me when I was looking up the ancient ice ages, because I was originally just trying to get an understanding of Michael Ord's objection to them, and then I ended up learning about how they're correlated with ocean, like cyclotherms across the world.
Yeah.
Those correlate with oxygen isotopes, and I mean, it was all just really cool.
Continental movement, all that stuff, yeah. And you find then that's one of the things that makes it annoying as a researcher, but exhilarating at the same time, is I already have like 3 or 4 stacks of things that I have started researching just today. That there's this material from this Erica Nephi debate, and then there's some material that I have on the dinosaurs and men together stuff, because the Ashley phosphate issue had been brought up, and so I was rehearsing that. That was another bit that was brought up by.
Was that brought up in the debate?
It was somebody noted that somebody had brought it up to it. I think it was Steve Ballman mentioned that someone on Twitter that somebody was bringing this up, and so I started looking into that. And then I've been looking at the new material, that Edward Isaac's paper, by the way, thank you, that hydroplate theory, problems for trench formation of the Pacific Basin. I wasn't aware of that little puppy. Oh yeah, that was a new one.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And so one thing, and then also another one that just popped up on Twitter that I was following up on, again, something I didn't know about, the Jack Hills zircons from Western Australia that date back to some of the very earliest days that you got rocks, and they're indicating when life was appearing, because you're starting to find little teeny inclusions that are characteristic of stuff that's being produced organically. And so that produces really a wonderful stuff. And there's a Vernon Cups over at ICR was snarking about that paper a little bit. And so that's going to be more material that is starting to accumulate material for Rocks Volume 2, to make sure that we can fill in all of this stuff, because we want to make sure that between the 2 volumes, we're hitting so much stuff that it will be harder and harder and harder for creationists to bring up claptrap that we won't have covered somewhere, so that you could use it as a resource that then you can springboard off of that to keep ahead of them. Because I think that, as Erica showed with Nephilim today, if you compare the way Erica handles a debate by having pre-prep and coordinating with people and learning and checking out what the person says and all that.
And Neff copy and pastes his old material.
Yeah. I think that's the principle that we want to have everybody down. Now, some will not want to go that route because they may be a little too lazy to do it, but use cooperative effort. interact with people. That way you don't need to know everything. You only need to be able to contact people who together you know everything. And that way you can focus on it. And anybody debating a creationist ought to recognize that you've got the fact that your average creationist that you're going to be debating is not going to do new research. They are repeating the same claptrap that they've been repeating over again. And you want to avoid that on your side. If all you're doing in a discussion with a creationist is trotting out the set things, this is one of the reasons why I tend not to do a PowerPoint presentation in advance. I improvise. I say, I want to talk about what they're talking about right now and respond as much real time and focus on that end of it and have a few little killer points that I can then drop as an anvil along the way, because we all know that in the course of video things, people are not typically putting up a reference in that. And we know Neff doesn't do that.
But then post any references.
But then afterwards, be perfectly willing to present the information on it, which I've tried to do in mine. Standing sort of does in his, but only so far, and it gets a little bit murky on that. Anyway, let me stop very briefly to thank my patrons, because we've slipped past about the half hour on there. Again, I am gobsmacked with the honor that it is that all the patrons are still patroning, and given the fact that times are uncertain. We don't know what the hell is going to happen. We're all waiting for the shoes to drop in some of these states that are starting to reopen. And are we going to get like a phase?
The shoes already starting to drop here in Florida.
Yeah, that's what I've been hearing. That there's a big scandal. That there's a big scandal over whether the governor of Florida and their administration has been pressuring the local CDC people equivalents to suppress the information.
Yeah, we just had a thing on the news about that tonight. What? They were, our state's been caught manipulating numbers, bud.
Yeah, remember, if you pretend that people aren't dead, they won't really be dead.
Or if you say, well, they were going to die anyway, so don't count that one.
Yeah, Granny doesn't really have that much of an effect on the economy. She was going to kick the bucket anyway. Let's make sure that Dow Jones is back on the track and then open up Disney World.
RJ, doesn't this seem awfully familiar to China censoring information coming out that they don't like?
Yeah, and this is something where, in fact, we're in a future book Jackson Wheat and I will be doing. We will be going into that whole not only anti-vaxxers, but also this bit about the COVID example, because this is a deadly example of how scientific misinformation and the politicization of science literally kills you.
It feels like 1918 all over again.
Well, yeah, and I have a closer connection to that because my mom almost died in the flu. And if you want a weird connection, technically speaking, Donald Trump's grandfather died in the flu. So there's a weird little resonance that's going on. The viruses will get their revenge. Anyway, let me continue with my patron thanking that our colleagues Hendril and Eric and Ben Simpson and Speed of Sound and Cyrus and Zeshi and our researchers Travis Adams and Ian Chan, the book guy, Convert Me and Eat Meal and James Fitzwater and History Minor and Ralph McFadden and Paulogia. And our assistant researchers, Mike Apple and Duranko and Torres Real, and our friends Daniel and Steve Bauman, great geologist. You bumped into that, Colton, I think, that quite a bit. He's a smart guy. Marigail Beddoes, Insects Are Cool, Devin Reeves, Morton Nielsen, Paul the Skeptic, Puffalevagus, Bo Rasmussen, Alex Stone, Paul Williams, and I will still thank the legacy patrons, Jen and Jody and John and Keith and Andrew and Dyer and Yui and Mona and Brad and Daniel and Yanya and Steigels and Son and Egli Juman Truls and Everett Vincent and Sue Weisbaum. Every one of you that's helped in one way or another, it means a lot that to be able to squeaky through on things 1 month after another and to be able to do things like food and ink and paper, that's really a nice thing to be able to do. So thank you for all of that. And then we can get back to the exciting world of the creationist exploration. I want the most boring criticisms of creationism, in my view, are ones that just try to make it a philosophical presupposition fest. And you get that they're just firing away up at the top layer. We all know how difficult it is to go into a lot of fiddly bit details with the data floor in a debate, but yet you want to bring that up. And I'm hoping then to get everybody marshaled into the source methods approach as the way to do that. Because I did in my debate with Standing for Truth a little bit ago, where I was asking him to explain his model and to document the sources, just as I'm willing to offer a source and so forth and so on. And if they're not willing to do that, that's a dead giveaway that you got a difficult problem on it. And if we can show that not only are we having more fun than they are, and we've got the information and it's exciting and wonderful, and we're going out of our way to point you to it and want you to do it too, and they're doing everything they can to not tell their sources and not check their material and scamper off on one thing after another, that will, in that blob in between the evolutionists and the creationists, the ones that are just kind of figuring it out, or the Colton embryos who were raised in a creationist frame, and then
is that what it's going to be called now?
The Colton embryo.
Oh my God, I don't like that.
The Colton embryo. There are a lot of people like that, because people that are raised in that framework, you have that from your own experience. That was your world. You saw that everything from that perspective, and then you suddenly went to a place where suddenly they start opening doors, and you realize, holy shit, there's all this stuff you didn't know about.
Yep.
Oh, that's always fun.
Yeah, it's vast. And when you start realizing that now, because we're in a circumstance where we got all these electronic tools that we can make use of, we can download PDFs. I just today, whilst checking up on this zircon matter, found a full text copy of Donald Prothero's 2018 book on geology and the 25 rocks that made the world kind of thing, and looking into material from Louis Agassiz and Hutton and all the rest. And I was able to glom onto that, no cost. And that's just absolutely delightful to be able to do. It's and the number of things that I've discovered, like on this stupid Ashley phosphates that a few creationists were fiddling with. It turns out the 1870 material that was done on that was available at Project Gutenberg. I could download the whole bloody book as a PDF.
Yeah.
That's the one where they're trying to, I realized why this reminded me, why I was going, why have I heard this before? And it turns out I had some of that material already downloaded earlier, because it had to do with the fact that creationists were claiming that in the Ashley phosphates, there were dinosaur fossils. And it's all because some people back in the 1870s described one of them as a hadrosaur. Well, oh, that's a problem. You know, this is real new paleontology. Yeah. And nobody since then and as it happens, there was a whole review of this from like 2020 or 2019 or so, where they went into the Ashley beds, and no, there's
the Ashley beds are almost completely gone because they've been almost completely mined out.
Yeah.
What was interesting was that what was interesting was that the company who was doing the mining was just kind of taking everything that wasn't useful and jumping it into the river. And so all these guys needed to do was trawl the river, and they could get representative fossils from the whole bed.
Yeah, they don't know what the taphonomy was, but they at least know what was there.
But what they did notice was that, because I noticed in Ian Juby's video on the beds, he's like, oh, reworking doesn't work, doesn't account for anything, it doesn't explain it.
Oh, I gotta have that. You gotta give me a link to that.
I'll give it to you.
Aware of that.
It was reposted on Standing's channel. But that's funny that he claims, oh, that doesn't work. And then he quickly says, but I don't have time to go into why. Funny he does that, because the damn paper that I found, the 2019 one we're talking about, says explicitly a lot of these fossils still have bits of the matrix of the underlying rock layers adhered to them, so you know they came from those. And there is reworking. Yeah, it's
just like a giant jigsaw puzzle. Yeah. And what's so fascinating about this, this is a really core. We should have like a video, an image or so, like when on Sci Strikes movie night, when they had science alert, you know, source methods alert to pop up, is don't take any creationist's word for anything, even stuff that seems non-controversial, because in tracking down the original material, A, you'll learn stuff. B, the older it is, you wonder why they're using such old material. So you want to look up newer material. And if they're doing like a video in 2019 and there's technical literature from 2015, how come they didn't know about it? probably because they're lazy effers, but it's also that why should they not have known about it? I, as the old fart on the computer, take the attitude, if I can find this stuff, anybody can find this stuff.
That was actually one of the things I noticed with Standing's video. When he reposted it, it was like in June 2019, and I looked at the paper, the review one that came out. Like, this was out in March, and you didn't like look this up. It's like the third result.
They don't look the gift horse in the mouth. That anytime, even if you're reading a regular science book, the date of something can just throw you off. I have a thing that I did, and it's in tip 1.7. It's all about Mark Tolleman, who was a creationist microbiologist, and it came up because he connects up with the argument that Michael Behe was trying to make at the Dover trial. So that's the context of all this. And so I was curious to know the background of Tolleman. Tolleman, although he's a creationist, it's hard to tell exactly what brand. But anyway, he only did one article, and that was on the biogenesis issue in Louis Pasteur. And it was all sorts of very great dissembling in my point of view. But the point is, he was riffing off of an old book on the microbe hunters from the 1920s. It's a classic book, but it's 1926, not 1990 when he's doing this material, let alone 21st century. And it turns out that although it was a perfectly fine piece of science journalism for 1926, it was not up to snuff for things we know almost 100 years later. And so always pay a close attention to that kind of stuff. In the same way that when I find people on our side trotting out Richard Dawkins's The Selfish Gene from 1976. Okay, but it's not 1976. Let's try to get forward in time on that. So
whenever I was bringing stuff up to Kevin Hankey when I was like starting to get into this, and he was giving me like research tips, he said avoid, unless there is nothing else published on it since then, avoid any work that's 30 years prior.
Yeah,
the current date. At least in my field, it's bad. Unless the only paper was written in the 50s.
If there's no new work on it, you have to ask why.
Yeah.
So it could be because it is a seminal work that basically was the last word on the subject, or it's kind of hard to do and nobody's gotten a grant on it since, and it's in some out of the way place that it would cost a fortune, or the place they want to go dig is in a civil war. And so nobody's going there because they're going to be shot. There could be all sorts of background reasons for some of these things. But the point is that failure to put things into historical context, to try to figure out what, if this thing was done in 1980, what's been done since then. There's a variety of temporal placeholders you can put inside of your mental map of time. And please construct a mental map of time in your head. If you're a young Earth creationist, it's going to be a tiny little map of time, but the rest of us are really big. So if you've got a bit for the last century of science, you're going to be knowing that cosmology started going through a convulsion in the early 20th century. So you start seeing Einstein and quantum theory and all of that.
And they start discovering that those island universes are actually galaxies.
Shit. Yeah, the universe suddenly got bigger. Then you start getting the development of DNA where they figure that out. But the real kicker starts coming in as they start applying it and doing actual genomes of organisms. And that's relatively recent. And so the discovery of homeobox genes and the actual scientists, Mel, you can probably confirm with me, typically, most of the papers that have been done on full genomes of organisms are 21st century works, not 20th. There are a few.
I think that's correct. I can't think
most
of anything.
Most of them is just recent. And sometimes it's hard to do because they have a difficulty. The other point is when you have the genome of an organism, that's the one that you have a population. So how much of that genome is typical of the entire species? That means another matter of work to go into, and that's where the actual science involves. To remember about that, homeobox genes and all that stuff is the mid-1990s. That's also a benchmark period for paleontology, because if you look at how much we had in fossils on, say, dinosaurs and origins of birds pre-1995 versus post-1995, It's like wandering around with the blinkers on, and then suddenly they pull the lights on, and holy shit, we've got all this material. So all of that as well, if you look in the chart in The Rocks Were There, shameless plug on the book, the chart we did of the various feathered theropods, how many of the work that's been done on that is only in like the last 10 years. So you've got just a total revolution. That means if you bump into some creationist that's trotting out Richard Prum's article or Brush's article on feathers from 1996, ooh, that's a dead giveaway. You got somebody that's trawling from a creationist source that isn't kept up to date because they don't have a clue as to what's happened since then. So those temporal benchmarks of in geology, plate tectonics, holy cow.
Yeah,
anything
I get real skeptical when people, I get real skeptical whenever I see people citing stuff that's pre-plate tectonics.
Yeah, it's not that excellent geology wasn't done, and that's true. But
have you ever seen maps of what people thought the Earth's internal structure was like prior to our knowledge of tectonics? I mean,
and before they had seismic testing, before they had all of that stuff. Yeah, they were trying to guess the inside of the cake based on the sprinkles on the frosting.
Yeah.
And that has limitations, you know? And so what the amazing thing was when you see it was all literally like a light switch. The speed with which geology switched to plate tectonics thinking was blindingly fast because suddenly everything made sense. It was the same reason why Darwin took hold so fast in plant biology. Botany went really fast into evolution, and it's really hard to find a non-evolutionist botanist. Non-evolutionist paleontologists were able to hang on far longer. Agassiz and Owen and that could filter all the way down into the late 19th century. But Asa Gray, he was one of the very first, and he was religious. Asa Gray just immediately jumped on it because it was like, holy shit, now all these plant varieties make sense. Now I see why it's going on. That as soon as you move out of that typological framework, it's like opening up. And suddenly in geology, it was mountain ranges and why volcanoes where they were. And then this whole plate subduction thing, which is not an abstract concept. I live in a region where the Cascadia fault, if it goes, holy shit, we are talking mega disasters on the Pacific coast. Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, tidal waves, earthquakes, land subsidences, plus 100-foot tidal waves hitting Japan from here. That's how big the Cascadia fault is. Yippee. Oh, it was funky. There was a show. If you don't catch it on National Geographic, assuming you get National Geographic on cable or whatever, they've been having this wonderful series that's just gobsmacking. Drain the Oceans series, where they get the latest seismic data, and they just digitally just drain the water away. So you're walking across dry land,
ocean floor,
looking at this old submarine that crashed in 1942, and they're looking at the thing and pointing to the hole and saying, this is where the bomb went off, and here's the forensic detail is just fabulous. And you couldn't have done this kind of thing even 5 or 10 years ago. The technology has advanced so much. Anyway, they had a thing on these subduction faults and a lot of these catastrophes that are around the Ring of Fire. And it was like old home week because they're mentioning the Storiega of a collapse in New Zealand 170,000 years ago, which we allude to in The Rocks Were There, these mega landslides that can take place and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm going, yay, mention me. Oh, there we go. We're in
it. I'm going to head off because, well, I'm feeling kind of sleepy.
Okay, well, sleep is good.
All right. Night.
Yeah, I've also got something I've got to be doing tomorrow, so see y'all.
That's good. Recharge the old batteries on that. Yeah, that's where we are. So anyway, that's I can heartily recommend that as a fascinating series because it's visually arresting. They deal with a lot of historical things, everything from looking at old Civil War battle scenes and ships that are underwater from there, super tankers losses. They had a whole series about as we build these bigger and bigger ships that they have disasters, how incredibly difficult it is to anticipate the thing that's going to go wrong. So they build these ships. It turns out that this one oil tanker, that one of the biggest oil spills ever, they built it single hull with 1.5 inch thick steel.
Is that the Exxon Valdez?
Yeah, I think so. The one that went off the coast of Africa. And
I don't know that one.
Yeah,
but using a single hull on an
And so
oil
they had to figure
tanker.
out, no, you better use double hull. And then
Something
the other
that seems so obvious in hindsight, but I guess in the moment just doesn't seem like a problem because it's an inch and a half of steel. Who cares?
It reminds us of the engineering because there's a tremendous desire to make everything as cheap as possible. This is not a new phenomenon, but some of the difficulties with stress fractures in Egyptian pyramids, you know, as they kind of have to get their learning curve as to how to build all this crap, or how thin can you make a flying buttress and still buttress before you start having things falling apart on you. You have to go to the edges of limits. Early technologies have a tendency to make these mistakes because they want to make them as cheap as possible and as effective as possible. So the Comet jet disaster, where they were not anticipating the problems with stress fractures,
the windows
from high pressure and all that. And anyway, with these super tankers, it was something as simple as they would leave the loading bays all along the container ship exposed, and they would just let water come in and it would go back out. It turns out that there was a stress at one particular point that blew the door off of a ventilating shaft at one of those points. That meant that when the next time the water swung in, it went down the ventilator shaft and started filling up and filling up and filling up and filling up. And it was like an ice cube tray going up. And this gigantic container ship just went down in like 2 minutes once everything started kicking in. You know,
that reminds me of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Yeah, that was another matter. That was a highly overloaded ship. Everybody forget the damn Bermuda Triangle. You know, the Great Lakes have an awful lot of disasters in it because there was a huge amount of ship traffic that went on in that area.
And they're just as dangerous as oceans because of how big they are.
Yeah, and there's been some weirdness because of the fact that the sea level has, the lake level there has fluctuated. It would go way down and then it would come way back up. And a lot of the climatologists are still not entirely sure why these odd fluctuations are taking place in that. And is this going to be like the latest bit? On a completely unrelated point, Salt Lake, that if anyone goes to visit the Golden Spike thing, if and when tourism ever happens again and people get into cars and go places and see things, and talk to one another, and I know this is a strange idea.
Talk to people. That's crazy talk, RJ.
Yeah. Anyway,
the 1950s.
The Golden Spike commemoration thing from 1869 in Utah is not where the Golden Spike took place. That they had to move it because Salt Lake has gotten so much bigger in the last 100 years that it's flooded. So they had to physically move the entire arrangement back a ways. And they're even now talking about whether or not they're going to have to rearrange and put a big dike across the middle of it to prevent the stuff from flooding I-5 that goes down through there. It's rather funky because for a while, see, there's only like one river that goes into the lake. And for many years, when my mother was growing up down there, the lake was getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And there was this resort called Salt Air along the coast, and they eventually had to, it became abandoned. There's the fossil wreck of where Salt Air used to be, and they had to put a new one out at the new shoreline. It's now gone because the lake has expanded backwards and has expanded all of that. And of course, why anyone would want Salt Lake anyway? It's nothing but brine shrimp out there. It's the smelliest place I've ever been in my life. Anyway, they're going to get nasty letters from people in Utah, but I've been there, so
The best thing about Utah is not, in fact, the Mormons, but in fact, the fossils.
Oh, there, the vernal Utah dinosaur thing. I went to I think the last time I was there is like the 1970s, and I haven't been able to go there since then. But it's a wonderful fossil thing to deal with. There's Mount Timpanogos Cave that's up in the Wasatches. In the southern part of the state, you got for people who don't like heights. Do not go to Bryce Canyon because you're like 9,200 feet there.
Okay, the one time I went to Bryce Canyon back in 2017, and I was with my dad, he tried to get me to like come up to the ledge and look down. Like, no, I'm sticking by the trees. I'm not going anywhere near that edge because I'm deathly afraid of heights.
Oh, by the time I went there, I was old enough that I had gotten over that aspect of it. And there's nice little trails. It's actually wonderful little hiking trails. You could spend hours and hours and hours going around in there. The thing that when I was a little kid at Griffith Park Observatory, which you see it in a lot of movies, It pops up in a lot of different contexts. So if you've seen any good science fiction films and stuff, the Rocketeer, there's a big finale sequence with the airship. It's a Griffith Park Observatory. Anyway, they have a Foucault pendulum there. And when I was a little kid, there's a ring around that Foucault pendulum, and it's inside of a thing so people can't touch it or anything like that. I was screaming bloody murder not to see over that. If somebody tried to pick me up and hold me up so that I could see over that gap, this is like 8 years old, I was just in panic because I thought this was like a tunnel to the end of the earth, that it was like a bottomless pit and that I would fall down and I would be absolutely terrified of it. It's only like about this deep. So that was my extent of my little panic zone with the Foucault pendulum. And now in retrospect, because of course it's one of the proofs that the earth revolves, so all the flat earthers should be the ones who would be screaming bloody murder at the sight of a Foucault pendulum. Okay, well, we're just about up into the end of the hour, although we started a little bit late. But there were any good questions or anything from the live chat? Because I haven't been spotting that at all.
Well, Standing showed up for a few minutes.
Yeah, I was going to say that actually when RJ was done. Say hi to SFT.
Hi, Standing for Truth. Are you ever going to fact check your sources?
Don't bully him.
Oh, well, he's an amiable person. He's more amiable than Nephilim. He has a more visible source base than Nephilim, but that's not saying much.
Yeah.
And so I'll put you on that category, Standing. But the point is,
Standing. We prefer you here over C Brown.
C Brown's a jerk.
Yeah,
you're nice.
Only thing that annoys me is you make your sources screenshots instead of like a link.
I will warn you, however, which I have done directly and will do so again. If you're thinking of relying on Jesse as a historical advisor for the Answers in Genesis pseudoscience history series that Jeanson is doing at AIG, and relying on her for any historical inferences whatsoever, please run for the hills. No, don't do that, because Jesse is a credulous copyist of superficial material, and as very confident as she is, no, what she does is not history. And so, I mean, you can make some of these creationist arguments without relying on her. There's a limited amount of material on there, but you're actually, I think here's a terrible thing, Standing. You're going to have to start thinking for yourself. Start researching on your own. Look up the technical literature, and there is an enormous amount of technical literature on the history of these various regions of the earth, not just the Americas, everywhere. And if you want to build up a creationist model where you can fit that data field into the flood model, where you say, okay, here's Noah and the kids, they're getting off the ark at such and so a date, and then in this period, this is happening, and this is how many kids are generated, and this is how much population needed to have moved over here and moved over there, and here's the evidence that we see for that. And eventually, and remember, we have to deal with the animals at the same time. So are there any of the animals moving with them? And where are they going? And why are they ending up where they are? Why are they taking the crops that they are? And why do they end up where they are? And all of that stuff. And then all the pottery development and the written languages and the various, I don't think you have a clue how much data field there is out there. That just like the amount of data field that we have with geology, the historical data field, and it will involve radiometric dating, but there's way more than that. There's fission track dating. You've got all the material from thermoluminescence material, and this vast interlocking.
Yeah, RJ, I'm used to geology as a very historical science, being very in depth with sources, and even then, when I look at history stuff, my brain shuts down. There's so much information. I have a hard time figuring out how
and we have a new layer when you're dealing with that, because if you see a pottery fragment, it's not merely the pottery fragment dated to a certain period. It's the images on the pottery fragment that's telling you what the pottery fragment maker had in mind as to what images were they doing, what gods were they dealing with.
In my archaeology class, last semester, we were actually talking about how different pottery fragments, when you see all these like weird images on them, turns out a lot of it was just branding. So you knew where you can use that to track who made it and where it came from and how it traveled on the old trade routes.
Oh, in the same way, it's more recent than ancient pottery, but in the history of playing cards, does anybody know why American playing cards look the way they do?
No.
Why the kings and queens and the things with the jacks pointed one direction and all that?
Here's
Here's the trail
from you before.
The American playing card is the copy of the British monopolistic playing cards that the British forced us to take because they didn't allow domestic card production. The British copied them from one version of the Rouen format French playing cards that the French monarchy established as a documentation procedure to determine where the cards were made so they could tax them efficiently. So that you would be able to know instantly from the court cards what region a particular card was from. And there were two different versions of playing cards that were made in Rouen, and one of which, the lesser one, was the one that the British copied and forced us to buy, which we then started making independently and turned into the American playing cards with rounded edges because of poker and the little squeezers up in the corner. So all of that traipse along, and the French monarchy would fight wars based on the amount of taxes they were raking in from playing card manufacture, which is the reason why many playing card makers were near the border of Spain and Belgium. To this day, to this day, Fournier down in Spain is near the French border, and Turnout, I think it is, over in Belgium, is near the French border, and the French border changed various times because of dynastic wars. But the point is that sometimes the taxes would just get so steep that you just move over the border and make the cards there. So that same thing goes on, that where this is one of the reasons why I'm not as intimidated by the sciences as some people might expect, my not coming from a science background, because I come from history, where not only are you sticklers for the historical detail and the technical points from that forensic point of view, but we got to deal with the fact that people can lie and they can put up the big inscription that's just bullshit. We can date the bullshit to 4500 BC, but it's still bullshit. And so you got, it's as though you were, it's as though you had stelae of Fox News postings that are buried through time, and you have to bear that in mind. So you already are dealing with a level of mendacity and how to wheedle around that. Whereas in geology, you don't have to worry about the rock telling a lie. The scientists made bullshit, but the rock is an honest little critter.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not gonna find the onion in rocks like you would in history.
You can't exactly force a rock to say something it doesn't.
Yeah, and so when I would look at any science area, whether it's astrophysics or geology or paleontology or biochemistry or systematic zoology, it doesn't matter what. It's just history light, where you're dealing with exactly the same forensic material. You're looking at sources. You're looking at what consensus views are. The consensus view can end up being wrong, but the point is that you have a sense of what's going on, because we find exactly the same thing in history as you find groups that try to interpret new facts. And the old guard, everybody that knows Arthur C. Clarke ought to know about his various rules that he had, one of which was the more famous one, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. My downward corollary of that is anything that looks like magic is just a sufficiently advanced technology. But he had some other rules too. And the other one was, if a distinguished but elderly scientist tells you that something is impossible, he's very probably wrong. And if a distinguished but elderly scientist tells you that something is possible, they're very probably right. You know, there's something, in other words, you have to remember that things can be overturned. And so Clarke always had a fascination for that kind of contrarian point of view, and he would be looking into stuff. He had a soft spot for the space elevator, which you still find some people having a hankering. It's theoretically possible. That's what's so annoying about it. If you can make a cable, the idea is that you have these Lagrange points up in orbit, and you could theoretically have a cable from a Lagrange points geosynchronous satellite and have an elevator to space, literally. If you can make a cable so light and thin and strong that it doesn't break of its own weight and collapse of its own weight. So it has to be incredibly lightweight, but incredibly strong. Theoretically, maybe nanofibers and stuff might work. And it's just an enticing holy grail that makes you want to think of it. And he was very attracted to that idea. The skeptic in me goes, yeah, I won't get a ticket on that yet. Okay. Well, anyway, that's sort of the RJ's on a train of consciousness rant here. thanks for everyone showing up on things. We're keep on going on stuff. The one nice advantage about all the creationists that I lob with during the day is it gives me fodder for the part 2 of Evolution Hours going out like for months, because they keep on coming up with new stupid in there. It is absolutely delightful. But don't accept any wooden penguins. Keep on doing research, source methods, fact check.
When they say Manetho said something, make sure you find what Manetho actually said.
Oh yeah, and as opposed to Mantio, who's an entirely different person. and look up all this stuff. Never rely on a single source for anything. Even somebody who buys my fabulously brilliant book with Jackson Wheat. Don't assume that everything in there is gospel. No, we don't want you to do that. Use it as a springboard. In the same way that I don't get pissant about people using Wikipedia. Nothing wrong with Wikipedia, but it's not a destination. It's a doorway. It's a springboard. And you can use that from a source methods angle. It's a universal toolkit. Scientist Mel uses the same sort of a thing. Colton, Paul Gia, everybody that I've been bumping into and building a network of are becoming increasingly overt about source methods analysis and how that is the universal toolkit that you can use to tell if something is claptrap or not, whether it's in drinking bleach to prevent COVID-19 or anything else. It's a universal kit, and it gives you a degree of humility on recognizing how tough subjects are. And if you think because somebody on YouTube said something that it's therefore true and you're never going to fact check it, well, poo. So shut us down for the night, scientists. I'll go on forever.
Okay, no problem. Thanks for tuning in, guys. You guys have a great night.
Good
You
night.
too. So everybody stay safe.
Sleep well.
Yeah, well, that's the one thing I never have to worry about. Even though I'll talk right through it. Nephilim is a useful window into a particular creationist niche. And he's very useful for that point because he's opening up and blathering on bringing up a subject, which a lot of which are giving us clues as to what the Nephs of the world are doing in their apologetics. So following